Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for our event, Best Practices in Starting and Scaling Your MMM. We have a great session ahead of us today, and this is a topic that we've received a lot of interest in. So we're really excited to be hosting this for you today. I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to start with just some standard housekeeping items for the next couple of minutes. Then we'll jump right into the MMM discussion, and then we'll dedicate some time at the end for some Q&A. So to touch quickly on what this session is going to cover, in case anyone needs a recap. So today we're going to discuss, many different points around MMMs. Our speakers here, we're going to touch on common challenges and misconceptions that are often faced when starting an MMM. We'll talk about key considerations to help minimize risks, and then any tips to help make sure your MMM and any related processes are scalable as your business evolves. And then, as you have probably seen, this session will be a little bit different than our standard webinars. So today's session is going to be in the form of a fireside chat. This allows us to cover the above points in a way that's a bit more conversational with actual stories and kind of real-time learnings. And for a topic like MMM, which can be quite technical, we think, this will be a really great format to help kind of connect the dots or spark some ideas for your own MMM initiatives. And then two very quick housekeeping notes before introducing our speakers. So first, of course, this session is being recorded. We'll send a copy of the recording as well as any follow-up materials in a day or two leading up to the session. So just keep an eye out for that. And the next, so at the bottom of your screen, you should see a questions tab. We encourage everyone to submit any questions you might have, and we'll do our best to answer them. If not today during the Q&A, then afterwards during any post-session follow-up. But please note the questions will all be public. So we ask that you do please show respect to both our speakers and also to your fellow attendees. And you'll also be able to upvote or interact with any of the questions too. So if you see a question that looks exciting, something you're interested in, please be sure to engage with it. And that'll help us know to try and prioritize that during the session. And then one thing we would love to hear from you now, just to know what you're most excited to learn about today. So as we're getting started here, feel free to start typing in questions now on a topic or question that you might be interested in learning. And now I'm excited to introduce our speakers so we can get started. So first we have Kristin Wozniak, a data and insights lead in North America from Labelium. And if you're not already aware, Labelium is a digital strategy agency that helps clients across the globe drive digital performance with innovative and forward-thinking digital strategies. And then we have Mark Debenham, our VP of Growth Marketing and Marketing Operations here at Adverity. And if you're not familiar with Adverity, we are an integrated data platform that makes it easier for you to scale and automate your data operations while also helping improve trust and confidence in your data. And with that, I will hand it off to you both.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you everyone for joining today's fireside chat on marketing mix modeling, or MMM. I feel like MMM has been around for a long time, but recently, despite being around for a long time, it feels like it's making a comeback in a big way, especially with all the privacy changes and such that are happening in digital marketing. So before we dive into the details, Kristin, I want to start with a bit of a big picture question. So there's been a lot of buzz about it making a comeback, and I feel like some marketers might feel like it's a bit of an old school approach, but it's clearly something that's gaining traction again with a lot of others. Why do you think that is?
Yes. Hi, everybody. There's a lot of excitement around MMM these days, which is kind of in some ways funny because we're having these huge conversations about Gen AI and robots taking over the world on one hand. On the other hand, we're talking about MMMs, which have been around since the 80s, I think. I think there's really 3 or 4 things that are driving a bit of this resurgence. And the first one you mentioned already, Mark, is the idea of privacy. The rules and regulations around data are getting stricter, as they should. And with the sort of decrease and potential eventual demise of the third-party cookie, a collection of the methodologies we've been relying on are no longer tenable in quite the same way. Things like multi-touch attribution is a bit more of a challenge with the loss of the third-party cookies. So we're looking for other types of ways to measure what we do. I'd say Two, a lot of those methodologies have been provided by our platform providers, like the Googles and the Metas of the world. I also feel like there's a little bit of a resistance right now to the idea of someone grading their own homework. So people are looking for a little bit more objective views of what's working and what's not. Thirdly, I'd say that there's just the reality of the industry being so flippin' complex. It sort of used to be able, like years ago, you could look at one channel and get a sense of what, of what's working and what's not. But everybody kind of lives in their own swim lanes right now. You're an expert on something very nuanced or unique in the marketing world. But we also all know that things work better when we understand the relationship between them. And again, that used to be able to be facilitated with a conversation or like a dashboard in some ways, but we can't do that anymore. I'd say the fourth thing for me that's, kind of important here is that we're looking for, I think, things that are trustworthy. And what I mean by that is in a world where, everything is so chaotic in terms of Gen AI is moving so fast and there's new solutions every 2 minutes. There's really this feeling of like, oh my God, what do I trust? Like what's good, what's bad? What if I deploy this thing and it doesn't work? Or it turns out to be, snake oil, as it were. There is something really comforting in like, okay, this has been around for a long time and I know it's not perfect. But like I know how it's not perfect and I can get on board with that. So there's sort of like I kind of feel like an MMM in a way is like putting on a pair of sweatpants. You know what I mean? It's like, it's comfortable. I know what to expect. It's not perfect all the time, but like, this is good. Yeah, that's kind of
Thank
where I'm
you.
at with it.
Yeah, thank you for that. As you were describing that, and particularly like talking about the past and the future, you mentioned, I think, something about attribution, multi-touch attribution. And I suppose because it's not always reliant on that first-party data and it's used to looking at, factors happening elsewhere and trends, it almost feels as though there's something somewhat future-proof about it from the compared to, like any changes in regulation. So it feels as though like hearing some of your words back that when there's uncertainty happening, that this is a tried and trusted way of measuring the return on investment. What would you, so like with that in mind, would you say that like, teams when they're first adopting an MMM model, like for the first time, do you think they have any kind of struggles with the data, or are there any kind of key performance indicators that keep them all aligned? Like, how do you find that like clients sort of best succeed with their metrics?
So when people ask me, we want to embark on an MMM, what's the first thing to do? How long does it take? And I think some of my team are probably on the call today too. I mean, the easiest answer is the actual MMM part is kind of the easiest part of the process. It's collecting the data and getting all the foundations right, which is by far and away the hardest part of the process. It's defining your KPI and not just defining it, but making sure that you have alignment on it internally. Because if you believe that your KPI is this, but your boss thinks it's this, or someone other team thinks it's this, you're not going to get adoption of the model on the other side. And then I think that there's sort of this sense of, oh, of course we have the data. Someone can pull it together somewhere. Don't worry, we have teams for that. And you actually start digging and you realize that you have bits and pieces, or someone somewhere, we have it, but they've been pulling it together manually behind the scene in an Excel sheet. And that is typically when the MMM process can fall apart, in some ways, even before it gets going. So I think having like real conversations about what data you actually have, where you're at in your sort of data maturity, and your willingness to talk about it and not just sort of pretend that all your data is perfect. That's the hardest part. I'd say on the other side of that, the socialization and use of the MMM is the other hardest part. So the very beginning and the very kind of end part of it, the middle is easy. I say easy. I'm not the one who builds it. So I'm looking at my team here and I'm going like, thanks guys. But that's the easier part of the process.
And are there any like kind of metrics that you prioritize over others? Like, do you have any favorites and others that are kind of like a bit more secondary, you say?
Well, I mean, the primary most important metric is your KPI. If we think about the way an MMM works, essentially you're looking for relationships between the thing you want to improve. So typically that's sales or revenue or engagements of some kind, And then on the other side of the equation, you're looking at all the different things that could potentially impact the growth of that dependent variable or your KPI. So if you don't get this part right, in terms of your KPI and actually what you're measuring, you can have a whole bunch of really great metrics on the other side of the equation, but it doesn't matter because you're fundamentally comparing them and looking for relationships against a metric you don't actually care about or isn't really representative of your business. And I think that it really is the hardest part. I talk to clients all the time and they say things like, oh, we have 12 KPIs. Which one do you pick? And I'm like, no, if you have 12 KPIs, you don't have KPIs. You have measures. We shouldn't have 12 of them. So that's the prioritization always first and foremost. Everything else can typically be managed. And I say this with like a big asterisk, knowing that on the other side of the equation, thinking about what things you want to bring into the model, offline data continues to be a challenge. Bringing in marketing spend and behavior on things like TV or out of home, it's still the trickier part of that process.
That's really great, like point around the collaboration and some of the metrics to align people. What I'm wondering is like, I think there's no substitute sometimes for kind of having seen the movie before, like actually having the experience. So you know what pitfalls to look for and you know how to kind of make sure everyone on your team's on the same page. Are there any kind of like, without going into like specific people that you've worked with, are there any kind of examples of the way you've really noticed like there's been that gap between what the reality is and what the data is showing, and it's kind of being a helpful reminder of what's happening later on?
I mean, yes. There are many.
I know you said I know you said there might be one or two members of your team on, so happy for you to, I'm sure they'd love to kind of recall some of those stories.
So I think that I've been focusing on the upfront part of the MMM process. And again, we could talk about that all day, but the real short version of that is like have real conversations about the data you have and be honest about what's really there and what's working and what's not. On the other side of the equation, sorry, not the actual MMM equation, the process equation. So at the end part, some of the challenges and complaints I hear from clients or just the general industry is, I invested X number of dollars in an MMM, we got a report, great learnings. What a waste. It's sitting on the shelf. I don't know what to do with it. And I think that's often the result of a lack of collaboration between the folks building and managing the MMM and the teams who actually have to use it and make decisions. It's very easy. Look, I come from the data world. It's so easy to live in a bubble and do great work and look for models that look great and are robust and check off all your boxes. But the box we sometimes forget to check is, does this actually make sense in the real world? How do we interpret the results in this way? And so I think that, to your point, an example of this is years ago, worked with a collection of folks who were building an MMM for an auto company. And at the results part of the presentation part of the process, the analysts came in and said, we did the work. Great. The finding is that this particular amount of spend to support this car model isn't working. So we recommend you just kill all the spend behind this car model. Now, on the ground, great, these dollars aren't effective, put them somewhere else. The dealers then go, wait a minute, I have 20 or 50 or 100 of those cars on the lot. Like, thank you for recommending we don't spend money behind this, but what happens to my business now when I have 100 cars sitting here? And so the other side of that MMM challenge is really about how do you make sure that your teams are truly collaborating so you're putting forward results that are actionable and in the process, quite honestly, not pissing people off. Like the second you do that, you've lost them. It's done. They're never coming back. And fair enough. So that to me is like, I hear that in my head all the time. Like, how is this actually going to be used for real on the other side?
Yeah, and that's such an important point because it's something that's fully within your control just to have that moment of collaboration up front. And if that doesn't happen, then you end up with an example like that, and it can really harm the relationship that you'll have with them later on. So, no, many thanks for sharing that one. Like, it really kind of brings it to life how important it is to make sure that conversation happens. So would you say that like, like would you say that there's any kind of like typical kind of process that you'd go through to make sure that everyone is aligned at the very beginning? Like if you were to sort of think, right, like think back to like the most recent sort of client that has transitioned into either using an MMM model again for the first time, or one that revisited it after like sort of not pursuing one for a few years. Is there any kind of like typical sort of process that you'd sort of think needs to be there to make sure that best practice around collaboration happens?
Kickoff calls. It's so basic, but if you were about to
Mm.
spend, I don't know, $1 million on a campaign or more than that, whatever it were, you'd have a kickoff call. What are we doing? What's the goal of the campaign? Are there any limitations? Are there any red flags? And I think treating an MMM not like a thing, how do I put this? I think sometimes people think about data projects as being, a thing you can just click on a menu and buy. Like, oh, I've ordered this thing, they'll deliver this thing, great. It's a living, breathing piece of work in its best form. So to get it going from the very beginning, you need your analysts who know what they need to make it go. You need your internal business leads, the folks who actually works with the client, to know what are the questions the client has, what are their concerns, are there any things that we deal with on a regular basis. We need someone on the client side who's like a point person to make sure that they're there to answer questions about data or anomalies or anything that we see. Those are the three crucial people, and they need to work in lockstep. If you are missing any one of those, you're sort of barreling towards a MMM delivery with not a lot of meaning.
I love it. And also, I suppose it's sort of like it's a good chance to actually kind of like manage those expectations around, it sounds great starting off an MMM, process, but like being prepared to actually, not just pay lip service to it, to be like, right, let's not be scared of what the data shows us, I guess. Like, would you say that that's a common kind of thing that everyone needs to sort of like clear the air on as well?
I was saying this last week that when I first started off in data, I was putting together a report for someone, and I had said something like, oh, this thing performs the worst. And my boss was like, Kristin, you never say the worst. The answer is least well. It performs least well. So like, yes, there's like a whole bunch of challenges in terms of the way you communicate and then the way we think about fear around these things. Like if we show this, are we going to look like we've screwed up? Are we going to look like we, don't know what we're doing? Or how does, our client, share this with their boss when the results don't meet the objectives? That's all just part of it. Of course it's there, but that's partly why that communication and that sort of trio of people is so important. So you have those
Mm.
conversations early on. It's not that you avoid having them. You have the conversations early on so you're prepared to have potentially a challenging conversation down the road. Masking the data, there's no point in doing it. If you're going to make up the results on the other side and hide the challenging conversations from the very beginning, you might as well just not do it in the first place. It's a waste of time and money, and everybody's ends up frustrated, I'd imagine. That's kind of the point. You want to figure out what's working and what's not. So you've got to be willing to talk about what's not. And actually, that's another thing. If you're not willing to have that conversation, maybe don't do an MMM.
I love it. So
Or really
yeah,
a lot of measurement, actually.
yeah, definitely. Yeah. Not just M&M, but just generally kickoff calls, always a great idea. I suppose also like sort of picking up from what you're saying, it feels as though like it's rarely like a one-time setup thing, something that you have to constantly nurture and look at and maintain as new data comes up, comes in. Like the data keeps on coming. How do you like, is there anything that you think is really successful or really scary that you've ever seen? Like sometimes with teams, as things start with MMM and then as it scales up, like could you talk a little around your experiences there?
Knee-jerk reactions for me are the scariest. You get results from an MMM, and that doesn't mean, like, let's just say you see that you've overspent in one area and it makes sense to optimize. To run around immediately and start to move money from one pile to the other. Like it's similar in the stock market and finance. Like take a minute, take a breath. What is this actually saying? What are the circumstances by which this has been created? what is the right step? I talk about data and measurement a lot, not as, and some people argue with me, and that's fair. I don't think of data as a source of truth. I think of it as a voice around the table, meaning that's imagine data as a person sitting around the boardroom table as you think about building your strategy for the next year. What have you learned from that person? What has it taught you? What are the surprising things they bring to the table? And then you think about how you best integrate it and either use it, or there's versions of which you ignore it too, because maybe it's just not the right call for the brand at this time for a whole bunch of reasons that aren't included in the model. So I think there's a really big important element there of thinking about it as we talked about this, like a living sort of entity versus a deliverable, a single project in that way. I would say too, I'm just noticing one of the questions in the chat around validation of MMM models, things like that. I want to just touch on that for a second, because one of the first things I said is that people kind of are reverting a little bit to MMM is because of that trust factor. It's like, okay, I know how this works. I know it doesn't do these things well. That's all right. Deep breath. And with machine learning and Gen AI, the number one question I get is like, well, how do I know it's working? And the hard reality is you don't until you use it. That's how it works with machine learning and Gen AI. You build a thing, you test it out, you see how it works, then you go back and you modify and you tweak and you build, and it's iterative, always iterative. With an MMM, I mean, I was going to say gold standard, but I'm not even sure that's true. But best practice is hold out data. It's not even overly complicated, but you build your MMM, you hold some data back, right, from when you build your model, and then you run your model on that holdback data and see if it matches reality. Holdback data is best practice, and it's something that I would ask any person who's doing an MMM or thinking about doing it, ask your provider about holdback data and how they use it, because that's one of the very simple ways to validate or verify sort of the robustness of your model, make sure it's not been overfit, and make sure it's got some legs to actually predict forward. Sorry, I know I pivoted a little bit there, but I saw it and I was like, oh yes, I do want to talk about that.
Yeah, no, definitely. And sort of like, yeah, we encourage any other questions as well in the chat. So when you say about holding back data, could you, just to sort of like make sure I'm kind of following, could you give me like, is there a specific example that comes to mind, or like either one that's happened or like another one, just to sort of like really sort of like paint this picture, and then, what the kind of benefits that could be found later on?
Yes, except for the fact that I missed the first part of what you asked. An example of what data?
Oh, like when you're sort of holding back the data, I suppose.
Oh,
like what would the kind of like scenario be there? Yeah.
Yeah, so if you're running your model, you'll hold back, say, let's just say you have 3 years of data to improve or to sort of build your model off of. You'd hold back, say, the last 3 months and not include those last 3 months. So they've already happened, but you take those 3 months out, and then you build your model on 33 months of data, not the 36. And then once you have your model, you then run that prediction on the 3 months of data to see if your predictions from the model line up with reality. If you overfit your model, aka you have built your model in such that it accounts for every single potential nuance in the data in the last 3 years or so, but because it's got so granular, it actually doesn't really know how to predict forward because it's looking for all of these nuances and these outliers. If you have overfit your model, you'll notice in that holdback data that your predictions don't line up with reality in any kind of meaningful way. And that's, if there's anything surprising from that, not really. I think the surprising part for me is that people don't do it. That's the surprising part of the holdback data for me. It's not so much if it comes back and your reality doesn't match your forecast, you go back to your model and take another kick at the can. It's more if you don't do it, then you're truly recommending optimizations to your clients that talk about $1 million decisions that are based on a model that you've not taken the time to validate. I don't know if that actually answers your question.
No, it does. It does. It makes sense when you describe it like that. And like, just sort of going back to sort of like when it's talking about like sort of when the data keeps on coming, how do you find that like sort of teams of analysts sort of like, is there anything common pitfalls when sort of working with those teams? Like, what would you say are the like telltale signs of success or failure as things kind of scale up? Are there any experiences there you'd like to share?
Sure. I mean, data, you're right. data changes, it keeps on coming. And worse yet, data keeps coming and then decisions are made from people not on that team that impact your ability to be successful. So for example, I've worked with a client before where we put together a full MMM, and then essentially the next day, for reasons beyond anybody's control, there was a decision to change the KPI of the business. Or it's the same KPI, but measured in a completely different way. And that's incredibly frustrating and hard. Again, it speaks to the importance of trying hard to get that KPI right from the very beginning. But it really, again, speaks to the importance of the collaboration. And I know I sound like a broken record on it, but you need then someone on the ground internally to be able to say, wait, pause, we have a problem. Someone's changed the priority internally. But I also have examples of, teams working really well together with the client to then say, we need to change the naming convention, or actually we've adopted, a new deal with said partner. We need to put caps on certain spends and things like that, that then actually create really robust outcomes. It's, again, not about getting it perfect the first time. It will never, ever be perfect. Perfect is a misnomer in data. The idea that there is one right number is something we just need to get out of our head. There's a million different ways to measure things. And it's about making decisions along the way about the best possible approach for us. So as the data keeps coming, chances are we'll update the model, we'll change our way of thinking. And it doesn't mean the previous version was wrong. It means we've learned new information, and so we're making it better. And I think that's a real challenge, is it's not, if something changes, it's not that it was wrong the first time around. And data folks are really afraid to share something that looks wrong. Clients hate the idea of something looking wrong. It's just growth and learning together. The more you know, the better the model is, the better the outcomes. I could keep going on, but I'll get off my soapbox.
No, that makes sense. I remember when we spoke about it briefly before, you described it as like you've got these people that are like problem solvers often, and there's ambition to be like, here's a problem, I'll be able to find a way to fix it. And I suppose it's that collaboration, particularly in those kickoff calls, and aligning on, right, these are the specific metrics and timeline we can work towards, that really kind of balance sometimes that problem solving with the commercial needs often.
Oh yeah, if you ask, I was saying this to one of my colleagues this week, that if you ask a data team, can you do this? The answer will almost always be yes, because data teams are problem solvers. They're curious. They want to find answers. And the answers a lot of the time are out there. You just have to do the work to figure it out and figure out a plan. There's a difference between what you can do and what you can do today. And I think that's an important difference too, when you're like collecting your data and thinking about laying out the framework for your MMM. What can you do in terms of data collecting and actually establishing the model, versus what can you do in 12 months with a whole bunch of time and cleaning things up and getting it right? Neither are right or wrong answers. It's just two very different questions that are important to ask.
I love it.
As I talk about the possible versus probable.
Yeah. So no, it makes sense, and I think it's a common balancing act in a lot of departments and a lot of industries as well. Michelle, in terms of like time, like it'd be great if there's any particular points they can recap, and Kristin, if you want to add any notes to any of that, that'd be lovely to hear.
Perfect. Thank you both for this conversation. It's been great. And yeah, just like you said, Mark, just to recap a few of the key points and common themes I've seen here, especially if anyone was a bit of a late joiner. First, I would say collaboration and team alignment is, we've seen, definitely key to both the initial and long-term success of an MMM. This includes kind of the internal alignment across many different teams, as well as alignment with clients when applicable. And that could be anything from the process side to talking about your data maturity and data setup. Just keeping collaboration with teams is very much key. And second, I would say one thing that stood out to me listening to you speak, Kristin, is not to be afraid of the results. You spoke that MMM is a bit of a living entity versus a single time deliverable. And the point is to learn what's working and what isn't. So if you see the results that might be shocking, don't have that knee-jerk reaction. Take some time, talk with your team, treat it like any insight where you might have to take other factors into place. And then you can proceed mindfully. And if changes are needed, that's okay. That's just part of the learning process.
Ask questions. Ask all the questions.
I can see, there's another one. How does Adverity support marketing mix modeling beyond its core functions of data connection? So does it provide any specific features? Yeah, so it does. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to copy and paste that, Carlos, and I will make sure that that I can give you like a longer answer because I can see that we've already gone 2 minutes over, and I'm like very keen to test Zoom's webinar limits, but we'll make sure that I get a long answer for you. Awesome, thank you. I think are we pretty much. I think we're pretty much out of time unless anyone wants to get in one before the end. Another question. But I've got copy and paste notes of everything. Hitting that screenshot on my keyboard. Yeah, thank you everyone so much for joining, and a big thank you to Kristin as well for sharing her expertise with us. I've learned so much from you, and I'll be listening to this again to make sure I actually internalize everything that you said here. Thank you so much.
And I apologize, no cats appeared in the making of this video, but they're definitely around. So I promised that on LinkedIn. I didn't follow through, so my apologies to everybody.
Something for the sequel, isn't it?
Perfect.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you both.
Thanks,
Thank you, everyone,
everybody.
for joining us.